dear friends, welcome. I'm Mario Theriger, and today I'm here to present an introduction to the introduction of classical Greek studies. As some of you might remember, I've actually started with a video concerning the Greek religious mysteries, which you can see right here, focusing on the Eleusinian mysteries, Orphism, and the Dionysian cult. It was not my intention to go any further than that, but in the meantime I've done other videos, such as one concerning legalism and another one on the gods and heroes. So I've decided to start this new series on the history of classical cultures, following the Greeks, and when it's all said and done, I shall move eventually on to the Romans. And these videos will serve as an introduction and guide to classical studies. So on today's video, it's an introduction to all of this, a sort of introduction. Of course, starting with the transmission of classical culture. That's what this video is all about today. Probably the most boring video I've ever done, but it is what it is. I'm sure it will prove to be useful to those taking the first steps in studying classical cultures. Now, before we start, if this is your first video, for those of you who don't know me yet, well, fuck it. This might be the most boring video I've ever done, but I can assure you there's plenty of content in this channel that is far more amusing and entertaining, hopefully. Hit that like button and subscribe to help me out here, please. So, with no more delay, let's get started, my dear friends, if you please. I think it is important to highlight here that when we have the knowledge about Greek and Latin cultures today, this was due to a very long and complex process. I think it's interesting, before approaching this study, to take a moment to examine the ways in which the documents on which we will be based on from now on in these studies, in these YouTube series and the previous videos as well, were transmitted to us, right? And these ways are fundamentally two: the archaeological and the literary one. Well, as you know, I was an archaeologist for 11 years. I don't recommend it, at least not in my country. But anyway, concerning this subject, here we have a problem with archaeology, which is, in relation to classical studies, archaeology has been exploring these themes since the 19th century. We are mostly talking about an activity that, from that time until the middle of the 20th century, was a common activity carried out by members of the European nobility, which largely consisted of simply searching for artifacts without a scientific method, leading to the great destruction of archaeological contexts that cannot be recovered, which does not help in the study of the contexts themselves in the original spaces. However, it is a fact that since that time, many precious artifacts for these studies have been discovered. Finally, from the mid-1950s onwards, archaeology really began to be a study focused on human social sciences and societies with its own scientific methods, and has evolved since then, becoming an actual scientific discipline and activity. Therefore, from then on, the studies are much more concrete and detailed, taking into account the entire space around where the artifacts are found, and it is a highly interdisciplinary scientific study. And fortunately, for the most part, it's not just tomb raiding and treasure hunting anymore. Then we have the literary way, right? Which is partly dependent on archaeology, as many have been in recent decades. I mean, there has been the recovery of texts brought back by excavations. But I must also point out that many historical texts often do not demonstrate the truth, the historical truth, and the archaeological work is especially important. It is fundamental in the contexts the literature tells us about, so that we can uncover the truth buried in these very spaces, which often does not correspond to the truth, but sometimes they do. And there is a better sense of historical context when face to face with the reality that has been left behind. Now, The transmission of written texts is also done in two ways, either through a continuous succession of copies, which date back to antiquity itself, or through papyri, found by archaeologists. To assess the importance of these finds, suffice it to say that currently the oldest known literary papyri are from the 4th century before the Common Era, when previously the oldest manuscripts that had been found were dated to the 2nd or the 3rd century. And almost every year the Egypt Exploration Society in London publishes a volume with the Oxyrhynchus papyri. Right? I mean, even an auxiliary science was even created, right? The papyrology, to decipher these difficult written records, which have brought back to light, alongside many documents of, let's say, lesser interest, some works of primordial importance. I mean, it is enough to mention, among others, many others, of course, but very important documents, the Constitution of Athens by Aristotle, the Odes by Bacchylides, long passages by Menander, and more recently an entire comedy by this author, countless fragments of the Aeolic tragedies and lyrics, and so on and so forth. Literary transmission, in order to be carried out in a lasting way, presupposes firstly the knowledge and the use of writing. So writing, it existed in Greece in much earlier times than was supposed a few years back, right? In fact, since the so-called Linear B was deciphered in 1952, it is known that already in the 15th century, before the Common Era, the Mycenaeans used a syllabary to make their records, a syllabary that derives from the Linear A, not yet deciphered, which was used by the Minoans. And precisely because the language used in Linear B was already Greek, it was possible to establish this equation, henceforth fundamental for these studies, that the Mycenaeans were Greeks. But this complicated writing process, which uses a different sign for each syllable and not one for each sound like the alphabet, completely disappears from memory with the so-called Dorian invasion in 1100 BCE, and thus remains forgotten until archaeologists dig it up in modern times. What is certain is that the Greeks who came later felt the need to import a writing system from Phoenicia, the alphabet which they adapted as best as they could to their phonetics. It is this alphabet, in fact, with several local variations, of course, that would later serve as a model for Latin, Gothic, and Cyrillic, and in this way is the basis of all writing processes in use in current Europe, in the Americas, in Australia, and in parts of Africa and Asia. When this import takes place, we do not know. Maybe it was around 800 BC. In the current state of scientific research, the oldest inscription found is from around 775 BCE. Now, although primitive poetry was, as everything leads us to believe, composed and transmitted orally, we currently tend to assume that the Homeric poems would have been the first epics to use the new writing process around 800 BCE. However, it is assumed that it was with the appearance of prose that the habit of composing books was established, which would have occurred in the 6th century BCE with the work of the philosopher Anaximander. From another later philosopher, Heraclitus, we know that he deposited his book in the Temple of Artemis in his native home in Ephesus, certainly to prevent it from being lost. It is also certain that the philosopher Hecataeus composed a book. In the 5th century BCE, the practice was widespread, and in the 4th century it was so deep-rooted that the writing of books began to become more common from then on. It is to be noted, however, that the tradition of oral teaching still practiced, it seems, apparently, by the oldest philosopher, Thales of Miletus, and it persisted in other great names such as Pythagoras and Socrates and Plato. Plato proclaims its superiority over writing. In fact, the existence of libraries and bookstores can be documented as early as the 5th century BCE. There is even an ancient account that mentions a shipwreck that Many books were lost in that same shipwreck. In Rome, Cicero's friend Atticus had many copyists in his house, something we could call perhaps an early publishing network of sorts. From an early age, the habit of building libraries had been formed. Euripides' library was famous, but the best one seems to have been the one collected by Aristotle in the 4th century BCE. In turn, a disciple of Theophrastus, the philosopher Demetrius of Phaleron, would have played an important role in organizing the richest and most famous library in all of antiquity, that of Alexandria, of course. Furthermore, in the Hellenistic era, there were others of importance in other kingdoms separated from the empire of Alexander the Great, such as that of Pergamum. The Roman conquerors brought with them Greek libraries. In Rome, we know that Augustus founded two, at least, the Palatine in the Temple of Apollo, with Greek and Roman parts. A few years later, that of the Field of Mars. Then it became an imperial habit. Tiberius, Vespasian, Trajan, each founded their own libraries. Hadrian ordered one to be opened in Athens. These were in general close to the temples, but of course there were also private libraries. In fact, these were the first. Cicero, Atticus, and Varro had private libraries ran by their slaves, and they were as essential to a home as a bathroom. I mean, the libraries, of course, or so wrote Seneca, the same philosopher who accused his compatriots of having books for ostentation only. But well, when we talk about libraries, we naturally think of shelves full of books with shiny bindings, but this was not the aspect they had at that time, as writing materials and format were very different. Now, leaving aside the primitive hard materials such as stone, metal, clay, and others that were only occasionally used, we have firstly the papyrus, coming from the stem of a plant that grew in abundance in the banks of the Nile and its delta, unfortunately today only in the upper part of the river, and even in Sicily as well. Since the 6th century BCE, it was used in Greece for writing. A story narrated by Pliny the Elder, based on Varro, explains, in terms of cultural rivalry, the replacement of papyrus by parchment. In the 2nd century BCE, the kings of Egypt would have banned the export of writing material to Pergamum, so that this library did not surpass that of Alexandria, but this kingdom invented a new process, parchment. Papyrus was a fragile material, easily deteriorated. The parchment, made from properly treated animal skins, was strong and resistant, but had the disadvantage of being more expensive. This is certainly the main reason why it was common to erase a text that was no longer of interest and write another one over it. In fact, this practice is observed almost only on parchment, while on papyrus examples are rare, very rare. Fortunately, modern chemistry, modern science can recover ancient writing. Thanks to this, extensive excerpts from lost works in their entirety could be deciphered, such as Cicero's De Republica, on the Republic, right? What is certain is that the advantages of the new writing material were such that the substitution of one for another was already taking place in Christian writings from the 2nd century and was complete in the 4th century. A typical example is provided by the testimony of letter 141 from Saint Jerome, which states that the papyrus books in the library of Panthyllus of Caesarea, having deteriorated, were replaced by copies on parchment. The latter, in turn, ends up being replaced by a product of plant origin, paper, a Chinese invention brought by the Arabs to Europe in the 8th century, but only widespread from the 14th century onwards. The form of the book also evolved through antiquity. It began by being a roll, which rolled up or unrolled each time it was used. A curious trace remained of the reading process in medieval manuscripts. Even when that format had long disappeared, Copists continued to write at the end of the text that they had translated explicit. That is, everything is unfolded, right? And at sometimes in an understandable rant or venting of their fatigue, they would add Dio gratias, thank God. In general, it can be said that the roll form accompanies the use of the papyrus over time, and that of the codex, made up of sheets stitched together in a similar way to our books, coincides with the spread of parchment. It is possible that its expansion is due to the use given to it by Christians who have used it since the 2nd century. It was easier to handle, especially when it was an extensive work, and so it soon gained, or it soon became preferable, right? In the golden age of patristics, that is, in the 4th century, the replacement of the scroll by the codex can be considered complete. And this flourishing cultural state is violently broken by the so-called barbarian invasions. I mean, if Byzantium was still able for many centuries to safeguard Greek works, this was not the case at all in the overthrown Western Roman Empire. We enter Dark Age, so-called because of the little we know about it, and almost the entirety or the entire legacy of classical antiquity would have been lost if it were not for the patient work carried out in the 6th century by two men, two ecclesiastical writers, Boethius and Cassiodorus. I mean, Boethius, the celebrated author of the Consolatione Philosophiae, he was a philosopher of exceptional culture, or so people say, the last of the Romans, and as some call him, although I do prefer the movie The Last of the Mohicans, or the bridge between ancient and medieval culture, as others classify him. He intended to translate Plato and Aristotle into Latin and reconcile their doctrines. He was ordered to carry out this work by Theodoric. And then the figure of Cassiodorus is also linked to that of this emperor, but in a completely different way, as he was his minister. First of all, he is distinguished by the attitude he took in a dispute that spanned the entirety of the Middle Ages, the opposition between sacred and profane knowledge, pagan and Christian knowledge. Cassiodorus intended to achieve harmony between the two. It is for this purpose that when founding, in the midst of the Justinian's struggles with the Goths, the monastery of Vivarium in Calabria, Italy, he gave monks the power to copy the Bible, of course, and both profane, pagan, and Christian authors. These instructions concerned spelling, text correction, and handwriting. So a new type of monastic life was thus created, dedicated to study. The monastery founded by Cassiodorus was short-lived, but the example came to fruition among the Benedictine monks of Monte Cassino, erected in 529, even after their convent was destroyed in 581, and they took refuge in Rome. Italy is therefore, or became, the largest center for the preservation of classical culture, not only speaking of the Roman one, obviously, of course not just that, but precisely the classical Greek culture of antiquity through the hands of ecclesiastical writers. And next comes Spain, where in the 7th century, Saint Isidore of Seville has an important role to play in this. And however, after the Arab invasion, only rare Visigothic manuscripts are preserved in the Iberian Peninsula. Then it is France's turn in the game with the Carolingian Renaissance, a time when beautiful and careful manuscripts were copied. Until the 12th century, we have the so-called period of the Great Abbeys, during which knowledge radiated from these important but isolated culture hotspots. From the 13th to the 15th century, we have the period of the great universities, where libraries soon began to be created that preciously stored an enormous wealth of codices. It was at this same time, more precisely between the 14th and the 15th centuries, that the great humanists discovered manuscripts with lost works by classical authors completely forgotten in monasteries. To just remember the most famous examples, let's say that Cicero's letters to Atticus, Brutus, his brother Quintus, and Pro Artia, by the same writer, were found and copied. And the Pro Morenna and the Pro Caecina were discovered as well, and other speeches by Cicero. In addition, the complete treatise, the Institutione Oratoria by Quintilian. In turn, 12 of Plautus's comedies were also found. In this very enthusiastic search for lost masterpieces, a prominent role was also played by Pope Nicholas V, who sent emissaries everywhere to search for ancient manuscripts and had a large number of texts copied and Greek authors translated into Latin. The collections he created would come to form the nucleus of the Vatican Library. In the same way, the Medici formed the Medicaea Laurentiana Library in Florence, Firenze, also a repository of some of the most precious codices of classical works. To conclude this brief introduction to how we came to know about classical history and authors, and overall of the transmission of ancient so-called classical culture, all that remains is to mention, of course, the invention of the printing press, which had a great importance in the spreading of these works, and the fact that a large work of the classical Greek knowledge was added, brought by refugees from Constantinople. So, this is how knowledge about the ancient classical world has reached us until today, has reached our days, right? Now, my dear friends, history nerd mode turned off. That was exhausting. I hope this video was useful anyway, or in some way. Thank you so much for watching. See you on the next video. And as always, thank you for today. Until we meet again, my dear friends.